Welcome to theAnalysis-news. I'm Barry Stevens, and I'm here with Paul Jay, the senior editor of The Analysis. And today we're going to be talking about Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and the big picture. Don't forget to subscribe, and there's a donate button. So if you like the channel, please do.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't.
Okay, that was Mark Carney speaking on January the 20th, 2026, the exact one-year anniversary of the beginning of Donald Trump's presidency. Carney is, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada, the formerly a central banker in Canada and Britain, and a Goldman Sachs alumnus. He was speaking there at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now, the speech, by the way, got a standing ovation, an enormous amount of attention around the world, and it annoyed the hell out of Donald Trump. So, Paul, is Carney right? Is this a new world order?
Well, is it a new world order? Well, obviously, what's new is the rise of China, and this process of having a peer competitor has changed the world, no doubt. The Cold War, and it didn't end with the fall of the Soviet Union. The essence of the Cold War was to assert what Luce called in 1942 the American century, which is essentially, even Carney used this word in a somewhat different context, but American hegemony. And that the non-Soviet world, and after the Chinese Revolution, the non-Soviet Chinese world, all of it should remain within the American sphere. And for decades, China was nowhere close to a peer competitor. And so the real problem for the United States was national liberation movements that all gravitated on the whole towards socialism. So the United States used overt force, whether it's in Korea, massively, millions of people died, a war that's barely mentioned anymore. Of course, intervention in Vietnam, and then country after country organizing coups and military interventions. And then, of course, a massive intervention in Iraq, and so on. So Trump doing what he did in Venezuela is not really anything new. Now, what was new about what Trump did in Venezuela, and what's new about what Trump is doing generally? And this is one of the lines from Carney's speech I thought was particularly interesting, which hasn't got much attention, which he said he's doing it without pretext. I think that was his word. In other words, it's not like they haven't been doing this kind of stuff, but they always had a pretext. You know, in Iraq, it's weapons of mass destruction. In Korea, it's, fighting for freedom and democracy, and so on and so on. Now, Carney admitted, actually, that people all knew that was bullshit. He gave this example of in the Soviet Union, a storekeeper would put a sign in his window, "Workers of the World Unite," when he knew that was just to curry favor and to show that he was loyal to the regime, and so, which was just a Cold War dig on his part. But at any rate, the point is Trump's being more naked about what the US was already doing. Now, as I say, it's a very complicated situation. So what Trump did in Venezuela is not particularly new, but some of what he's been doing in the tariff wars is new, because part of the Cold War framing of the world, you could say the way global capitalism was being managed by the United States, with the US dollar as the reserve currency as the critical core of that, was that Europe and Japan and Australia, Canada, in other words, the advanced capitalist countries within the American sphere should be able to kind of do okay. And the elites of these countries would more or less share in the fruit of plundering Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And Europe, partly because the United States couldn't do much about it. They weren't going to occupy and control all of Europe. They had to allow capitalist development in Europe to take its course, but always within NATO and the American sphere. In other words, tied to the American arms industry. But the EU did already create some separation between the European economy and the American, but again, not a rupture. Same goes for Japan. What Trump has done with these tariff threats and America first, and I have to say, American policy has always been America first. This is just a different interpretation of what's America first. There's never been globalism that somehow America has put its interests second to the world. The consensus, the liberal militarist consensus coming out of World War II was always America first. But that meant your allies had to do okay. You don't try to stick it to them. So what's new is two things. One is the rise of a peer competitor in China, and the United States has no real answer to this. And two, sticking it to the Europeans and the Canadians in a way to assert a US control. And it looks like Trump has overplayed his hand on this. The Latin American policy and the overall policy is all about what to do about China, but it's erratic. It's irrational policy. Trump's policies are creating a situation where Europe is actually going to wind up doing more with China. And let's get back to Carney. What was really significant about Carney is less the speech, although the speech was significant, but his trip to China. When Carney first came to power, was elected, he ruled out China as an alternative to Trump tariffs. He saw China, he called it the main national security threat to Canada, which was really just currying favor with the Americans. And it did him no good. And lots of voices in Canada said he was wrong. And now he's wised up and at least opened the door to what he calls a strategic partnership with China. And I'll get to what this means for Canada in a minute. But what does it mean in terms of how the Americans look at that speech and what Canada's doing and the whole tariff situation? It's important, I think, to understand that there's been, first of all, several different groups of capital in the United States. But there's always been a section of capital that wants a much more aggressive attitude towards American workers and a much more aggressive approach abroad. And it's embodied in a document, Project for New American Century, which was neocon, not Trumpian, but the values are not really different, which is it's time to really assert American power, which is why they changed it from the Department of Peace to the Department of War and so on. So that group, which is for really cracking down on dissent in the United States, for aggressively going after protest American workers and unions, Cold War-ish style domestically, and abroad, consolidate power in Latin America to the extent of pushing China out of Latin America. So from the point of view of that strategy, Trump is on the edge of pushing this far more hawkish, now Silicon Valley driven, military industrial complex, almost kleptocracy. And now the other elites in Europe and Canada, and Carney spoke for them at Davos, they are saying, okay, this isn't the world we signed up for. And Carney is saying and articulating something, and it is unique for a Canadian. Since Diefenbaker, there hasn't been a single Canadian prime minister that comes close to rhetorically saying something like this.
argue that middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination.
So there's kind of two questions here. Carney saying those things is a break, certainly with the traditional way Canadian prime ministers talk. Trump, there have been, some Ford and others have attacked Trump over the tariffs. But what Carney's talking about is a realignment of international forces. And he can do that because two things. One is China. The opening of this discussions with China is a message to the United States. Okay, you've crossed the line, Trump. That's opened up that us and Europe, Canada and Europe, have to get much more serious in developing our alternative trade. And two, rhetorically, this sure plays well in Canada and around the world. But has there really been a rupture, is the way Carney talks about in the rules-based order? Because the rule-based order always was the might is right, is the truth of it. There just was a paper-thin cover for it. Now might is right without a cover. In terms of especially the threats against Greenland, that's really pissed them off. They can live with overt threats or even kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, but threatening Europe directly with Greenland, that crosses a line. That in our order, our NATO order, our supposed rules-based order, you can threaten Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You can invade whoever the hell you want. We even may object to it at the UN, but there won't be any consequences for you. But you're going to go after Europe? You're going to threaten a NATO country? You crossed a line here. So the Trump has overplayed his hand on Greenland, and as we see now, he's already backed up. The next day after Davos, he is saying, okay, now they're going to negotiate a framework over Greenland. I don't think the details are out yet. He's taken force off the table. He crossed the line. So what, in terms of international relations, though, the change is all about China. It's about, will Trump go back to the post-World War II alliances with Europe and Canada and focus on China, which means go ahead with his plan for the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America? Or is he going to continue to overplay his hand in a somewhat irrational, erratic way that does not benefit American elites and finance? And you could see the stock market tanked after the Davos situation. The next day it went down, 900 points? And it was after it dumped 900 points, then Trump says, oh, no, I don't mean force. So there's this combination of things. There really is change taking place. The underlying is a peer competitor in China, and the US really doesn't know how to deal with it because they want the Chinese market. At the same time, they don't want a peer competitor in the rest of the world. Two, an erratic president, narcissist, backed by a crazy cabal in Silicon Valley. So there's kind of, I'll stop for a minute here, but there's two questions I think to pursue. One is, why is such crazy shit going on in the United States? And then two, can Carney actually carve out some real sovereignty for Canada, or is this mostly rhetoric?
The question of Canada, we'll return to that in a second. But just to go back to what you were saying about the shock of Europeans and elites, in this claim that Greenland should belong to the United States, and overplaying his hand. It seems like the entire political West is what Carney is talking about, standing together. When he talks about, we have the strength of legitimacy, integrity, and rules, but only if we choose to wield them together. And he's appealing in a sense to the entire political West to bind together to resist either China or the United States. Now, it reminded me a little bit of the non-aligned movement during the old Cold War, led by India and Cuba and people like and countries like that. But I think Carney risks, both as a person and as a Canadian, being way out in front, because I did notice that right after that, Mark Rutte was reassuring Trump that, of course, Europe will stand with you. Of course, we'll be there for you if you're ever in trouble. And I wonder now, if, despite the standing ovation and all the praise he got, whether they will all hang. They would say, if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. Well, Carney may be, and Canada may be the one left out in the cold.
I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. First of all, let me just reinforce one point. Rule-based order only applied to Europe, Canada, Japan, to the alliance of the advanced capitalist countries represented in NATO,
yes.
EU, Japan. The rules-based order was only for them. The rules-based order never applied to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we saw that in coup after war after coup after war, and onerous trade policies and so on. So what Trump did differently is he broke the de facto agreement amongst the advanced capitalist countries. And that is a different position than, say, the Biden administration or the Democrats or Obama, which considered themselves the managers of global capitalism. And during the 07-08 crash, actually loaned enormous amounts of money to European banks, even to European private corporations. They saw that the best way to advance America first was to make sure global capitalism didn't crash. So Trump's given up that role to some extent of the manager of global capitalism. And that's a great risk to American capital too. The problem for American capital is that their returns are up 14 to 18% under Trump as compared to under Biden. So in terms of tax cuts and deregulation, he's making them a lot more money. So Trumpian crazy vision of the world is making billionaires even richer, and they like that. But they're caught because he's giving up an important point of leverage for the Americans, which is the manager of global capitalism. I don't see how the Trumpian vision lasts, except, and the except I'll get to in a second. Now, is Carney going to get hung out to dry here? Canada's not as weak as it looks, and nor is Europe. They have big pools of capital. And as much as, for example, in Canada, American ownership is very significant, in the natural resource section, 15, 20% maybe. But overall, there are big pools of Canadian capital. And that Canadian capital is a global player. Carney refers to the pension funds. Well, these pools of Canadian capital now export more capital than is imported into Canada. Foreign investment in Canada is actually less than Canadian investment abroad, which shows some of the strength of Canadian capital, but also some of the absolute stupidity of Canadian policy. And I'll get to that in a second.
Canada has what the world wants. We are an energy superpower. We hold vast reserves of critical minerals. We have the most educated population in the world. Our pension funds are amongst the world's largest and most sophisticated investors. In other words, we have capital, talent. We also have a government with immense fiscal capacity to act decisively. And we have the values to which many others aspire.
So Carney's making a play to be the spokesperson, kind of the leader of the middle powers, which includes all of Europe. He made a mistake in his speech. He said the Canada and the Nordic countries make up 20% of global GDP.
Yeah, that was strange.
Yeah, well, it's not true.
No.
It's barely 4 or 5%, I think. But I think
he may have meant all of Northern Europe, like Germany.
no, I think he meant the EU. If you put the EU and Canada together,
Right.
you get to close to 20%, which is very significant. And if the EU and Canada really do protect themselves here, really do cooperate, really do say, if you're going to break the quote unquote pro advanced capitalist rules based order, then you're going to push us into taking a more independent position from you, and we've got a lot of capital to do it. And it's absolutely the truth. So I think what happens here is Wall Street and the finance sector says to the banks, not to Trump, and to Silicon Valley, no, you don't screw us up here, and you're going to wind up getting targeted. And that's what Europe's going to do. They're going to target Silicon Valley. And they're going to say, we're going to start freezing you out of some serious markets. So my guess is Trump's going to have to significantly cut back in this confrontation with Europe. It's been a great distraction from Epstein. It even distracted from the Venezuela. But it's not that he wasn't serious about Greenland. I don't think it was meant to be a distraction. Just before I again get to the Canadian thing, I don't think you can underestimate not Trump's narcissism, which of course is so on display, it's hard to underestimate, but the bubble, Silicon Valley billionaires, Trump, and the Christian nationalists around him. They are in a crazy metaphysical bubble. Some of them really do believe they're on a God-driven mission. You read Peter Thiel, he's full on into metaphysics, and all of these guys, one way or the other, are very Mussolini-esque. So there are times when cabals take power within these kinds of situations, within these advanced capitalist countries, where they are so overestimate their power and vision, they wind up dead. Mussolini wound up, hanging upside, he was beaten to death and hung up upside down by the Italian people from lampposts. Hitler wound up having to commit suicide. But these are people who thought they could rule the world. And I think the cabal, the Christian nationalist cabal, and the more Mussolini-esque, not so religious, but still into a kind of American God-driven mission, they really have these features. And I think the predominant sections of American capital are not that. They're more Jamie Dimon. They're more, what can you do for me today? But there is a point where you've done what you can, and now you're threatening me systemically. And we saw that on January 6th, when the American Association of Manufacturers on the 6th actually called for Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Trump. Because there's a certain point where this gets batshit crazy, and you actually are systemically threatening us, speaking for the elites. And I think we're reaching that line, and I think the stock market tanking was a message to Trump. We will sell off and scare the shit out of you on the stock market. You pull back on Greenland, and you stop this craziness. And they don't care if he wants to take over Latin America. They'll be all in on that.
It is remarkable because, of course, that crazy cabal controls the executive of the United States. There are two sources, I would say, of the United States power, and you can challenge this if you like, but one of them is the reserve currency, and the other is the military. Now, they do control the military, and that's not nothing. They may be crazy, but that's not nothing. And the other is the reserve currency. Now, there, I would imagine that those middle powers, like Europe and Japan and so forth, do have quite a lot of power because and it wasn't just the stock market, of course, it was the bond market too, which was threatened in the last few days, and probably caused Trump to backtrack.
Yeah.
But people do talk about them, with their bazookas and their going nuclear, of pulling, of basically crashing the dollar.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's real, but that is a power that the political West outside of the United States does have.
Well, I think you raised several important points there. The reserve currency issue is critical. And the attack on Jerome Powell at the Fed, according to Blinken, who used to be the head of Goldman Sachs, who was interviewed a couple of days ago, that's a challenge to the reserve currency. Because he says that the critical issue of the role of the Fed is guaranteeing that the Fed will not allow too much inflation because inflation devalues the American dollar. And the American economy depends on people buying T-bills. In other words, in a kind of reverse of the whole classical version of debtor countries and indebted countries, the United States is a debtor country, but in a way that helps it control and manage global capitalism. But if countries buy T-bills today and there's serious inflation starts to develop, then the dollars they're buying today aren't worth as much tomorrow. So Blinken was saying this threatens the U.S. role as reserve currency, because if the Fed, who the world trusts, it's not in God we trust, it's in the Fed we trust. If you threaten the trust of global capital and American capital, for that means, because it's the same thing, it's a threat to American capital inflation, because again, same thing, it deflates, it devalues their holdings. So that the Fed is absolutely fundamental. So it looks like the Supreme Court, as we speak today, I'm not sure where we're at in the most recent decision on the firing of that Fed member of the Reserve of the board. If the Supreme Court comes down against Trump on this woman, and essentially by doing that says he can't remove Powell as chair of the Fed, that's a vote in favor of the quote unquote rules-based order. In other words, we're not going to completely upset global capitalism and undermine faith in the Fed. Of course, there's another big Supreme Court decision coming on the tariffs. And if the Supreme Court rules for Trump, this is a vote for much more than just tariffs. And so is the Fed. It's the Supreme Court is saying, we're going to open the doors to a much more Mussolini-style authoritarian state. We're going to remove two of the basic things here. Congressional control over tariffs and other things, which Congress itself doesn't want to assert. And maybe even more important, the independence of the Fed. It's critical to the whole picture. I'm not sure which way the Supreme Court's going to go here. And by the time we publish this, maybe it's been decided. It's feeling like the Supreme Court's going to rule against Trump, which I think the Supreme Court is more loyal to finance capital and is more worried about pleasing them than they are Trump. But we'll see. Number two, you said they control the military. Well, they do and they don't. We'll see. If he tries to postpone, quote unquote, disrupt, cancel the midterm elections, let's see. We don't know. It's a $64,000 question. If he orders martial law, will the Joint Chiefs support him? Well, maybe. There's a lot of maybes out here because we're talking balance of power here. Again, the financial elites and corporate elites will not want that. Sections will. The far right cabal in Silicon Valley, they don't like democracy, even a veneer of democracy. There's certain significant sections of capital do want Mussolini-style authoritarianism. And it's not for the same reasons as Mussolini. It's not because there's such a powerful workers' movement, such a powerful socialist movement or communist movement, you know, or people's movement, which is the main reason why the Americans so liked Mussolini in the first place. No, there's sections of American capital that think there's no way to compete with China without a Mussolini-style state. You need monopolies. You need corporate state fusion in a way that antitrust laws were meant to protect. And you need a willingness to use force that wasn't part of this post-World War II order, which means it's okay to use force against non-nuclear countries. But get ready for war with China, well, maybe that's crossing a line. There are unknowns here. I don't think, you know, if I had to bet, I would bet finance capital will pull them back, but we'll see.
We should return to Canada because it is, you know, such a key player in these questions. But I always wonder, how long can the United States play this game, being a debtor nation, of rinse, cycle, and repeat? You know, basically, people lend the United States dollars. They accumulate dollars through lending them money, and then they spend those dollars by investing back into the United States. But at some point, this kind of violates classical macroeconomics, and I wonder, can it continue forever?
No, because there's just something that's fundamentally true, which is capitalism is fundamentally irrational. And no, this can't continue forever. This has to lead to another massive collapse, and then they rebuild again. And they either have a war of significant size that it can wipe out a lot of productive capacity, and then you can expand again into those spaces. You have a massive 07, 08, way bigger than 07, 08. You go back into 1930s collapse, but that's sort of part of the way the cycle works, if you will. And they know when crashes are about to come, so they make money out of that. But here's the wild card. They being the Trumpian forces and the elites, which for now the majority are supporting Trump, the majority, not all by any means, and certainly the Democratic Party aligned class does not. But they are awakening the American people in a way we haven't seen for a long time. What's happening in Minneapolis, I don't think can be underestimated. The tens of thousands of people in the streets, not only in Minneapolis, but across the country against ICE. The number of white people getting beaten up and put in jails and shot the way Black people and Latinos usually get it. They are awakening something. A kind of mass protest that's not just anti-Trumpian. I think it's taking on a character that increasingly is adopting some of the language like a Bernie Sanders, a billionaire class, oligarchy language. You know, this no kings. It's not just no Trumpians. It's also addressed at the billionaires around Trump. But it doesn't take any rocket science to know that there's billionaires around both the leaderships, at least, of both parties. The second thing, there have been breakthroughs politically. Mondami in New York, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting the name of the new mayor of Seattle. Listening to this guy, the mayor of Minneapolis, there is a language taken, a kind of language, progressive, not worrying about being called socialist. There's a breakdown in the Cold War psyche that's taking place in many of the big cities. And not only big cities. Bernie and AOC have been doing these speaking tours in Trump country and getting thousands of people, 30, 40,000 people out. There's this poll that came out not long ago that had AOC and Vance neck and neck in a presidential race. How real that is, I don't know, but it is an expression that just calling someone a socialist crazy lunatic communist, Trumpian rhetoric, he's using all the McCarthyite tools. It's not working the way it was working. So there's some, in terms of domestic politics and the midterm elections, there is a possibility of a really significant progressive breakthrough here. So, as much as we do this geopolitical analysis and all the rest, people should seize this opportunity. This is the time to get organized and to really make sure it's progressive, enlightened politics that makes the breakthrough and stops this Mussolini-esque attempt. And I think there's a real good chance at it. And we'll see, because the elites, there's an old thing that goes, it used to be a leftism, and I don't know who coined it first, but when the elites are at war with each other, that's the time you can have a breakthrough. The Soviet Revolution was after, in World War I, when the elites. Go on.
Yeah, just to push back against that a little bit, it reminds me a little bit of Tahrir Square back in 2011, when everybody had their iPhones and they're all kumbaya together and they thought they were going to change Egypt. But in fact, it was a struggle between the two most organized groups, the army and the Muslim Brotherhood. The same is true in every single big overturn, the Bolsheviks in 17, Modi's people in India, fascists or the Sandinistas, they're organized, they are thoroughly organized on the ground throughout. The United States is not. They're more like Tahrir Square than they are like the Bolsheviks.
I don't agree with that. But although I think, let me say it this way, I think your main point is correct, but let me go at it a little different way. Let's put it this way. Like in the Soviet Revolution, of course, I'm not a fan of how that turned out, but I think the important
I'm just talking about effectiveness.
Yeah. I think the point here is it wasn't so organized. It really wasn't. What was happening in the Soviet Revolution is the army split, and sections of the armed forces were in rebellion. The famous film Potemkin, the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. We're not seeing that yet, like in the American sense. But let's look at this. These breakthroughs electorally at the city level are, I think, quite significant. If they lose the House, the Republicans, if they lose Congress and the Senate, and there's the possibility of actually impeaching Trump, and Trump then says, I'm not going to listen to a word you say, I'm ruling by executive order. In fact, I'm even disbanding Congress. Like, if he crosses the line of electoral democracy and says it's over, that's where we're going to find out. Will the armed forces listen to him? Will they impose martial law in spite of breaking their oath to the Constitution? Will Congress actually do something about it? But it's going to wind up with who has the guns, not
who has the guns. Power grows from the barrel of a gun, and that's absolutely true. Just that I think when you look at these situations, and it's kind of incredible we're even talking about this, but when you look at these kind of situations, it's often at the kind of kernel level that these splits happen. The generals may all be, with the government, but what really matters are the kernel level units who can actually act with guns. Well, that's what I've seen historically. I don't know if it applies.
I think maybe a little less so in the United States because the armed forces are so massive. A lot will be determined at the level of the Joint Chiefs. But you're right. They're like the way this probably breaks out. Before the last election, 3 retired American generals said, if Trump loses, a whole section of the American armed forces, and at the level you're talking about, Barry, like colonels, maybe, some of the members of the Joint Chiefs, they're going to support a Trumpian authoritarian declaration. And these 3 generals warned that people better get ready for that now, because it's going to be decided by which way the military goes. Now, a lot of the military, are in and out of the military industrial complex all the time. They're very tied to finance capital. Even Silicon Valley. There's a line here where such chaos isn't good for business.
No.
Now, if they were facing a real socialist revolution, well, they'll say, you know what? Let's suspend democracy until we put this damn thing down. But they're not. I mean, they are facing an awakened people. But right now they're facing free buses. They're facing maybe publicly owned grocery stores. Nobody's talking about even, public banking on a broad scale. But they're awakening a force that might start demanding these things. The governor in New Jersey, the new governor, was on TV a couple of days ago on one of those Sunday morning shows saying, they're creating an insurrectionary moment for the sake of being able to put down an insurrectionary moment. But she's warning that you may be open. I don't know if these are quite her. The first part were almost exactly her words, but what she's saying is you're opening a Pandora's box here, because once you create this insurrectionary moment, you may not be able to put that genie back in the bottle. And that's what the Democrats are saying to finance capital, even some of the Republicans. So the cabal is pushing things beyond what capital needs, even though they're making a lot of money out of it. Now, I think, I think they're approaching a line where you could see the demise of Trump. And you could see the possibility they'll find a way to get rid of Trump and then have Vance do much of the same things, but with less erraticism, less narcissism, a little bit back more to the norm. Now, that said, I don't know that's what they would get from Vance, but they don't have a choice. He is the vice president.
But but even if it were Vance, that still would leave this situation with Europe. We've all heard how Vance talks about that and what they think about that. That still leaves us with this hemispheric sphere of influence. And that's actually a good time to pivot to
Well, can I
Canada.
just say one quick thing about that then? See, what Trump screwed up, the plan for Europe was a neo-fascist Europe, an alliance of the United States, Russia, and the far-right parties of Europe. Now Trump's even got the far-right parties screaming at him over Greenland.
It's the Poilievre. It's what happened in Canada. Mark Carney was not going to be the prime minister.
Yeah.
It was going to be a real conservative, Pierre Poilievre. But because of the nationalism that he aroused by attacking, we have Mark Carney.
So I think a Vance would likely go back to the original plan, which wasn't a good plan for anybody other than them, and even them, but a more fascistic Mussolini-esque, the current Italian Meloni, more that. And really, they wanted to really put the far right into power in Germany. That was the plan. I would expect Vance goes back to that. And American capital doesn't mind that so much, as long as it doesn't become anti-American.
Now, that raises a whole other bunch of questions. But in the remaining time, let's talk a little bit about Canada. Let me just set that up. Is that Canada is, of course, positioned, if you look at a globe from the top, between Russia and the United States. It's where a nuclear war would be fought, whether it was Chinese or Russian missiles and United States missiles flying over Canada. It's an absolutely giant of a country, and it's no small country economically. The world tends to see Canada smaller because when you put something middle-sized beside something very big, the middle-sized thing looks smaller. But it's not that small. And it's also got the longest trading border in the world, a very significant trading relationship. The natural trading partner is the United States. So here's Carney going to China. Here he is trying to lead a charge up a hill with the Europeans and behind him, supposedly, hopefully, creating something new. But geography has a lot of power. And where does this leave us? Where does this, because we are speaking, of course, from Canada right now.
Well, I think Carney's in a unique position to know exactly where Wall Street's mind is. You know, head of the Central Bank of Canada, then he's head of the Central Bank of the UK, and then he's a special advisor to the UN on climate, rallying, didn't go very far, but rallying finance, sections of finance capital on climate, so on and so on. He's as plugged in to global finance and American finance as there's ever been, probably any leader anywhere in the Western world outside of the United States. For him to make this speech, I think it's a speech mostly directed to American finance capital. He's saying to them, don't break the rules-based order, which is don't fuck around with Europe and Canada. Go do whatever you want anywhere else, but don't screw with us. We've been in your backyard. We're all on the same team here. You know, push us around a bit here and there with a little bit of tariffs. Okay, we can put up with it. You know, we'll go back and forth with you. We'll pander to you. But Greenland was across the line. Not just for Europe, it crossed the line for Canada, that you are actually throwing out the rules-based order that privileges us advanced countries. But he wouldn't make that speech, I don't think, if he didn't think he had more or less the backing of Wall Street. And I think that's the real meaning of this speech, the significance of this speech. That Wall Street can't say these things because they're afraid they'll get punished. Carney has done his math and he says, well, what can they do? They're already tariffing some stuff. We can counter tariff. Trump doesn't want to piss. Carney's got a lot of credibility and Trump knows it amongst finance. And it's a line. Trump's aware that he's pissing these people off. Okay, now let's deal with the other side of this. Can Carney live up to the rhetoric? Can he really carve out a kind of sovereignty, a diversification of the economy in terms of trading partners?
Canada's economy.
Canada's economy. Can he actually deal with what you just said? The geographical objective truth. We're side by side, 70% of Canada's trade goes to the United States. And can he do anything about it? And the answer is pretty clear. Yes and no. and the reason I say yes and no is within a normal capitalist framework, within the way things are, that Carney has bought, you know, is part of, is a spokesman for, is a product of, you know, within these kind of neoliberal economics, the answer is no. Because you can't diversify enough to deal with 70% of your export economy. But that's the question. Can you change the Canadian economy so it's not fundamentally an export economy? Why are we an export economy? We, because Barry and I are both in Toronto. You know, people know I'm a dual citizen. I'm in the US tons. I lived there for years. But at the moment, when I say we, I mean we Canadians. Why does Canada have to be an export economy? There's absolutely no need for it. But the fundamental problem is we don't have enough people. Our population is way too small in relationship to our physical size, to our natural resources. I mean, easily could support a population instead of 40 million plus that we are, of 100 million, probably 150 million. I don't know. But it would have to be done in a planned way with a big, big investment into hospitals, into schools, into infrastructure so that an increased population doesn't destroy the social safety net and create a complete chaos, a rise of racism and so on and so on. But of course it could be done. Canada has a lot of capital. I said earlier, Canada exports now more capital than it imports. Well, what if that capital came back and the government created public institutions, made all this foreign investment? Instead, you know, a lot of this investment are pension funds, big piece. It's like $1.5 trillion, I think, of the foreign investment is our Canadian pension funds, which includes union pension funds.
Oh, very much so.
So if they were serious, they would have big public investment, publicly owned, start building hospitals, publicly owned hospitals, put way more money into schools, and then start increasing the population. But there is one thing about Canada. Canada's had a very racist immigration policy for years. And look, some of the big cities like Toronto are already majority non-white. What I'm talking about, if you really are going to increase the population by double or triple, much of this population is going to come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But if we want sovereignty, let's give up this bloody racism, and let's build an actual independent economy, which includes diversified trade and all the rest. Honestly, you actually could do it in theory, within a capitalist framework. More like a Norway with a sovereign wealth fund that actually, captures, Norway owns 60% of the oil company there. Even with some of the Nordic capitalist models, there's ways to do much more of this, but we don't hear any of that from Carney. So
no, I don't think you will.
Yeah, I don't think we will. The only way we will is if we go back into some really serious economic crisis, and the crisis turns Carney into more of an FDR. FDR wasn't FDR until he understood how deep the crisis was. So we'll see, but I'm not holding my breath on seeing that. But our biggest problem in Canada is even our supposed left party, I don't even know if it really even calls itself socialist anymore, NDP. They're not really articulating this alternative vision. What would a sovereign Canada actually look like? Because we must fight for that, or we'll be drawn into this Mussolini-esque state. Because even if it isn't Trump, it's likely to be somebody like a Trump. I don't think we're getting over this. We're not going back to the quote unquote normal, which
no.
We're not going back. There is no normal to go back to, and in that part, Carney was right.
I think there are big arguments to be had and to be made against massively expanding our population that are ecological and sociological. But I don't think we'll go there, because for now it's a bit of a fantasy. But one thing that I think is interesting is that after the Venezuelan adventure and after the Greenland
I have to disagree with that. It's not a fantasy. Even in government strategic documents, recent documents, the last 5-10 years, the proposal about increasing population is always there. And in fact, even Carney's talked about it. But the problem is they're not taking the real steps necessary to make it possible. No, the issue of increasing population has, even from the right, people like Andrew Coyne have talked about it, who's people don't know who he is outside of Canada, but he's, it's on the conservative side of politics. No, the talk about increasing Canadian population, it's not a fantasy. In fact, it's the only way to have an actual more sovereignty in Canada. And even in elite conversation, it's talked about. They just won't do what's necessary because it involves, more corporate tax, more public ownership and such.
Well, at the moment, the policy immigration has been lowered, and that's the situation we're finding ourselves in. But what I think is interesting in very recently is that there's been actual talk among elites about defending this country militarily. That's actually been discussed. Everyone says, "Oh, of course it will happen, of course," but you have to plan for contingencies. And the Chief of Defense Staff, the Canadian equivalent of the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, less than a year ago was standing up and saying, "We always stand with the Americans. We'll always be with the Americans." Now they are talking about a 400,000 man and woman militia. We're talking about guerrilla.
Who's they?
Well, it's been proposed by the Department of National Defense, or not by them, but it's been discussed within. There was an article in the Globe and Mail just a couple of days ago about this, and retired generals like Fraser, who was in Afghanistan, talking about, well, we wouldn't be able to stand up to an American invasion um, in the standard military ways. Their tanks would roll into Windsor and Toronto and Ottawa quite quickly, but there would be insurgency, there'd be IEDs, there'd be a guerrilla war. Now, this may be a fantasy too.
Well, that's complete fantasy.
Well, it may be, and it may be, but what's extraordinary is that it's being talked about.
Yeah, but it's being talked about for a reason. It's because the Carney strategy is to pay tribute to the American military-industrial complex in spite of Trump's provocations. Carney's sending the message, we'll get our military spending way up. We will take our responsibility for defending the Arctic. There's some mild truth to that. The issue of contention over natural resources in the Arctic is something that potentially could be real, in terms of Russia and even China. I mean, that's not a zero, but I don't think that's fundamentally what's driving it. What's fundamentally driving it is we will spend tons of money on military stuff. We're saying to you, American elites, we're not breaking the rules. You are. You're with these tariffs, you're screwing with us. We'll keep to our end of the bargain. We'll pay tribute. We'll stay within the military industrial complex. Not only that, we want Canadian companies to keep getting contracts building arms for the military industrial. And, Canada's like the 9th or 10th biggest arms manufacturer in the world. I mean, not even close to what the Americans, Chinese, maybe Brits and French do. But after that, Canada's not an insignificant player. And it's not insignificant to the Canadian economy. No, this is just going to dress up Canadian military expenditure to look like it's a defense against the Americans. The threat of American military intervention in Canada, next to zero. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just a farce. There's no need for it. As much as Canadian capital. Listen, Canadian capital is significantly invested in the United States. I mean, the obvious symbol of it is TD Bank is all over the eastern US. There's major investments. Canadian capitalists are not going to risk their position in the US and vice versa.
Well, there's also
it's not going to happen. It's dress. It's a cover to excuse Canadian military expansion.
Okay, and part of that expansion is the Golden Dome. The $40 billion that I think was the figure that the then Defense Minister Anita Anand several years ago promised seems to be, forgotten by Trump, because he's demanding that we pay enormous amounts of money if we're going to participate. But Canadian territory is such, just like Greenland territory, it's positioned such that the Golden Dome, which of course technically won't work, but nevertheless will get a lot of investment. But Canada is positioned geographically that we are quite significant in that.
There is no Golden Dome without Canada. It's decisive. Without Canada, I don't think there is a Golden Dome.
Exactly. And you look at what it does exist, is the very small amount of ballistic missile defense that exists is in Alaska. And that's also what Trump has been talking about in Greenland. No question, we will be part of it. The question is, well, to what extent and how much is there a potential of resisting that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Canada just should say no, the way Diefenbaker said no to nuclear weapons on Beaumark missiles, except then Kennedy intervened in the Canadian elections, got rid of Diefenbaker and brought in Pearson. I mean, the precedent for a Canadian prime minister to say no on something like this ain't very good. Like I say, it ended to the demise of Diefenbaker.
Well, there may be no invasion, but there could be a coup, in other words.
Well, again, it's up to Canadians. Do we want to be part of a dangerous boondoggle? This is, let's not forget we have some agency. We can't be passive. Why haven't we been screaming as Canadians against the Golden Dome, against being part of any, we've already committed, what is it, $40 billion to modernize our NORAD radar system, over the horizon radar, which really means satellite based, which is a type of weaponization of space, which we supposedly are against. We've been traditionally against anti-ballistic missile systems. When the Americans abrogated the ABS treaty in 1972, we objected to it. And in fact, one Canadian government after another refused to be directly part of any kind of ABM system because we understood how much it destabilized and threatened the world. Well, no, under Trudeau, they started to buy into this. They did weather balloons about us even having missiles in Canada. We haven't committed to that yet, but we've essentially already committed a big upgrading of our radar system, which was predating Trump. So Trump wants to push that further. Should we say no? Absolutely. What has Carney said? Well, we're thinking about it. He hasn't said no. Now, maybe he's smart to think about it, because what we don't know is if the Democrats do take control of Congress, will they stop the Golden Dome? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to it. I know under Democrats, they have certainly put money into research and development of ABM, but they're not committed to anything like the Golden Dome, because, like I say, everybody knows it's a boondoggle. It's hard to say because a lot will depend on, who's in the White House, who controls Congress. There's a lot of ball up in the air. But what Canadians must demand now of Carney is say no to the Golden Dome. And, we're being very quiet about it, especially in the Canadian media is not saying a word about it.
My own view is that our military should be devoting some of its attention and some of its investment to the very remote possibility of the United States being militarily involved or militarily pressuring this country at the same time as maintaining whatever continental defense we have to, that is rational. But it's a difficult line to walk. But I
don't know what it means. It's so, the difference in the size and power of the two militaries is so ridiculous that if there's actually that kind of fighting, we wouldn't even be able to do what Ukraine's doing with Russia. The other piece of it that's important is how integrated the Canadian military command is with the American. I mean, what was that story during the Iraq War? During the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans were giving direct orders to the Canadian military, bypassing the Canadian government.
Yeah, that was.
Who knows? Canadian generals may be more loyal to Washington than they are to Ottawa.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated relationship, and I think it may be shifting. And I think this is not a bad place to wind it up. But there's a couple of things I just wanted to say. One of them is that Trump said after Carney's speech, irritated by Carney's speech, even though Carney didn't mention the United States or Trump, of course, everyone knew what he was talking about. And Trump said, Mark, you should be a little more grateful. Canada lives because of us. As a proud Canadian, I just really would like to point out that in the Second World War, Canada was fighting the Nazis more than 2 years before the United States came into the fight. So piss off.
Well, I don't have that Canadian fantasy nationalism in me.
I'm an immigrant, so I of course have
I'm not.
more Canadian pride than most native-born Canadians.
Well,
but it's true.
Let's put it this way. Americans can brag about creating Hitler in the first place. So.
Yeah, they have that on us.
Well, no, Canada was in on it too.
Anyway, we did fight, and we did die, and.
No, actually, there's an important point here. Let's not get sucked in by the use of this Canadian nationalism to promote Canadian militarism. Let's not have illusions that this really is about Canadian sovereignty and all the rest. It's very much about paying tribute to the United States and making sure Canadian arms industry doesn't lose its market.
Well, that's the argument. That's the kind of discussion we should be having. That those things are different, and that we do have this integration. For in Sudan, for instance, the RSF, the rebel group, has been seen with Canadian-made rifles, has been seen with Canadian-made armored cars. These things don't get talked about very much
Can I
in the
end with
Canadian
one
press, but
thing?
it's true.
Let me end with one thing.
So
Canadian,
our hands aren't so clean as we
yeah,
like to
I
pretend.
want to build on that just with one
Hmm.
point, maybe a final point.
Yeah, as it perhaps it should be.
Canadian capital is not more humanistic, is not more benign, is not fundamentally different than American capital. It's just geography and history that made the United States had the opportunity to become a global hegemon. If tomorrow some pandemic wiped out the American elites and left the Canadian elites standing and able to take up the mantle, they'd be overjoyed to be the world hegemon. And to the extent Canadian capital can, it does it through mining companies in Central America, banking positions in the Caribbean. You know, Canadian money has no problem plundering, making money off American militarist adventures. Canadian capital is not benign. It just knows how to play that role and look like that because the Canadian people on the whole are not so Cold Warish militaristic as large sections, not all, of Americans are. So in terms of Canadian politics, it doesn't play well to be an overt neocon hawkish. But Canadian
Mhm.
capital, they're happy to make money out of it if they can.
Oh yeah, I mean there are places in the world where if you're wearing a Canadian flag on your backpack, uh, you would not be as welcome as you might be in the Netherlands, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mongolia, places where people have been active against Canadian mining companies.
Mm.
At any rate, okay, well, this has been an interesting and global discussion with Paul Jay about all springing off Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos. We shall see what happens in the coming days in reaction to that, whether Canada is going to get targeted by President Trump, or whether the news cycle just moves on and everything is forgotten. Anyway, thank you for watching and listening to theAnalysis.news, and we will be back again to talk about all of this with Paul Jay, no doubt, next week.